The ship was called the Esperança, which meant hope in Portuguese, and Eleanor Wentworth thought that was either a very good omen or a very bad joke. She had been standing at the rail for 20 minutes, watching Portsmouth disappear behind a curtain of grey October mist. When she heard his voice, Eleanor point one word. No title, no Miss Wentworth, no careful social buffer. Just her name, said in the particular way that Alexander Hartley, Duke of Ascot, said everything, as though the syllables had been weighed and found to be the precise minimum required. She turned slowly. He was standing 6 feet away on the same deck, and he looked exactly as she remembered him looking 6 years ago, and at every brief, terrible, unavoidable encounter in the years between, contained. Still, like a man who had decided, at some early age, that the world did not deserve the effort of his full attention, Your Grace, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was rather proud of that I wasn't informed you would be on this ship. 4 words. She counted them, because she had learned, in 6 years of occasional proximity to this man, that every word he chose was deliberate. And these 4 contained a multitude of small cruelties. I wasn't informed, as though she were a piece of logistical information that had been incorrectly filed. You would be on this ship as though this were his ship, his crossing. His particular portion of the Atlantic that she had wandered into without permission. My father, she said, has many things he forgot to inform you of. A pause. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, not quite recognition. Whatever it was. It was gone before she could name it, indeed. He said, and that was that. He inclined his head, the smallest possible acknowledgement that she existed as a person rather than an obstacle, and moved past her toward the stern. Eleanor turned back to the railing and gripped it with both hands. Indeed. 6 years of social exile. 6 years of watching her family's name curdle from distinguished to unfortunate to something people didn't say aloud at dinner parties, and he offered her. Indeed, she had first met him in her father's library. She had been 17. And she had not known he was in the doorway. She had been looking at the 3 paintings her father had recently acquired an investment, had called them, though her mother had called them expensive proof that your father doesn't understand art, and she had said, to no one in particular. To the paintings themselves, to the general philosophical universe. This one is merely expensive. It has no soul. She had meant the largest of the 3. The one with the Italian countryside and the very competent brushwork and absolutely nothing beneath it. The kind of painting that announced its own price rather than its subject. She had not meant for anyone to hear it. She had certainly not meant for the future Duke of Ascot to hear it, but when she had turned around, he had been standing in the doorway, her father's study doorway, which meant he had been a guest in their home. Which meant she had just delivered an unsolicited aesthetic verdict on her father's property in front of someone she had never met, and he had been looking at her with an expression she could not read. He had not laughed. He had not looked embarrassed for her. He had simply looked at her. For 2 or 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. And then her father had appeared behind him, and the introductions had been made, and the moment had folded itself up and disappeared. She had thought about it occasionally in the years since. It was the kind of small humiliation that visited you at 3 in the morning without warning. You were 17 and you didn't know he was there. That was all. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. She had certainly never thought that he remembered it. The wind shifted, and with it came the first announcement from the ship's officer, a brief professional assessment of weather conditions that used the word challenging in a way that experienced sailors would understand to mean considerably worse than that. Eleanor looked west. The horizon had turned the color of a bruise. She thought about her destination, Lisbon, and her father's cousin's estate, and the small legal matter of an inheritance that her family's solicitor had described as straightforward and her family's accountant had described as potentially our only remaining asset. Do not mismanage this. She thought about the letter of introduction folded inside her traveling case, and the Portuguese lawyer she had never met, and the fact that she was 23 years old and traveling without family. Which was the sort of thing that required explanation at every stage of the journey. She did not think about the Duke of Ascot, standing somewhere on this same ship, looking at her absence the way he looked at everything with perfect Practiced indifference, she was very good at not thinking about things. The storm warning came at 7 in the evening. Eleanor was in her cabin third class, as it turned out, was a generous description for what amounted to a berth, a porthole, and an optimistic attitude toward ventilation when she heard voices in the corridor, followed by rapid footsteps, followed by the particular groan of a ship reconsidering its relationship with the ocean. By the time the officer knocked on her door, she already knew what he was going to say. She had spent enough of her childhood reading her father's books on navigation to understand that the Esperanza had just made a decision that the sea had not asked for its opinion on Miss Wentworth. The officer was young and making an effort to appear calm. We've been asked to consolidate passengers. Several cabins on the port side have been assessed as unsuitable for overnight occupancy, given the conditions. His Grace the Duke of Ascot has offered his cabin for your use. That I beg your pardon, His Grace's cabin is the captain's cabin. Ma'am. It's the most structurally sound room on the ship. His Grace felt that. His Grace, Eleanor said, can keep his cabin. The officer blinked. This was, apparently, not the response he had been trained for. Miss Wentworth, the alternative. What is the alternative? A pause that told her everything about the alternative. She picked up her traveling case. The cabin was larger than she had expected. It had a real berth bolted to the wall, with actual linen and a writing table that had been secured against the far wall. And a porthole that was currently showing her a view of the Atlantic Ocean doing something extremely unpleasant. Alexander was standing in the doorway behind her. I don't need your charity, she said. Without turning around. It isn't charity. His voice was even. It's structural engineering. That side of the ship is compromised. You would be moved regardless. The question was only where, and you decided where. Yes, she turned around then, because there was something in the word, not arrogance. Precisely, but a kind of uncomplicated certainty, as though he had done a calculation and arrived at an answer and saw no reason to apologize for the arithmetic. That he was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. And he did not look like a man who was doing her a favor. He looked like a man who was solving a problem. The distinction, she understood, was important to him. And where will you sleep? She asked. That isn't your concern, you're the one who arranged this. I think it's a reasonable question. Something crossed his face too quickly for her to catch. He pushed himself off the doorframe. Get some sleep. Miss Wentworth. The crossing will be worse before it's better. He set the key on the writing table. He did not look at her when he did it. He simply placed it there, a small brass key on a dark wood surface, and walked back into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind him. Eleanor stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the key. The ship tilted. She put a hand on the table to steady herself. Where will you sleep? She had asked, and he had not answered. And she was not going to think about that. She was not going to think about what it meant that he had spoken to the officer before she had, that he had known she would need the cabin before she had known herself. That he had made an arrangement that required him to vacate his own space and had presented it as though it were a matter of no significance whatsoever. She was not going to think about any of that. She picked up the key and held it in her palm. It was cold, and very small. And it felt unreasonably, stupidly like the heaviest thing she had held in years. Outside the porthole, the storm arrived in full. She did not sleep. This was not entirely the storm's fault, though the storm was making a considerable effort. The Esperanza moved the way a living thing moves when it is frightened, not the smooth, predictable roll of bad weather, but something more irregular, more deliberate. As though the ocean were testing the ship's conviction. Eleanor lay in the berth with one hand braced against the wall and listened to the wood speak in a language she didn't know but understood to mean, this is not comfortable for either of you. At some point past midnight. She needed water. The pitcher had been secured to the table with a length of rope. Someone had thought ahead, which she appreciated, and she was in the process of untying it when she heard something outside the cabin door. Not a knock. Not footsteps. Just a sound, very quiet, that resolved itself. After a moment, into the particular quality of a person being still in a space, she set the pitcher down. She crossed to the door and opened it. Alexander was sitting on the floor of the corridor, his back against the wall opposite her door, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his arms resting on his knees. He was not asleep. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been caught doing something he cannot adequately explain, and who has, nonetheless, decided that no explanation will be offered. For a moment neither of them said anything. The ship groaned. A lantern in the corridor swayed, throwing his face in and out of shadow. "You're sitting on the floor," Eleanor said. "Yes." Of the corridor, "Yes, outside my door." He said nothing. This was, she was learning, his preferred response to statements that were self-evidently true. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him, and he looked back at her. And the storm pressed against the hull from the outside like a third party attempting to insert itself into the conversation. "The officer said there were other arrangements," she said. "A second officer's bunk. A hammock in the cargo hold." "I believe," the officer was being optimistic. "Or you declined them." Again, nothing. Which was itself a kind of answer. She should have said something sharp. Something that would have re-established the appropriate distance, reminded him that she was not a problem to be managed. That she had been managing herself quite effectively for 3 years without anyone's assistance. She had a number of sharp things prepared, in the general inventory she maintained for conversations that required them. Instead she said, "There's a blanket in the cabin. If you're going to be absurd, you might as well be warm about it." She did not wait to see his expression. She retrieved the blanket from the chest at the foot of the berth and returned to the doorway and held it out. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. "Thank you," he said. It sounded like the words cost him something. "Don't mistake it for anything other than practicality," she said. "I can't sleep knowing there's a duke developing hypothermia 6 feet away." Something changed in his face. Not quite a smile, not anything she would have described as a smile, but a slight, involuntary alteration around his mouth. As though his face had briefly forgotten what it was supposed to be doing. "Naturally," he said. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a long time. The ship moved. The lantern in the corridor threw a thin line of light under the door, and she watched it sway, back and forth. Back and forth, and she thought, "He declined the other arrangements," she thought. "He is sitting on the floor outside my door," she thought, carefully and deliberately, the way she thought about things she did not want to feel. "He is the Duke of Ascot. And he understands that a woman traveling alone is a liability, and he is protecting the investment of having arranged this cabin for me, and it has nothing to do with." She stopped. She sat down on the berth and looked at her hands. I in her father's library, 6 years ago. She had said a painting had no soul, and a man she hadn't met had been standing in the doorway. She had thought about it, occasionally, the way you think about a small embarrassment briefly, and with mild discomfort, and then you set it aside. She had never once, in 6 years, considered that he had thought about it too. She lay back on the berth and stared at the ceiling and listened to the storm, and outside her door, on the floor of the corridor, Alexander Hartley, Duke of Ascot, sat with a blanket she had given him and did not sleep either. She didn't know that last part. That was, perhaps, the problem. In the morning, he was gone. There was no evidence that he had been there at all, except that the blanket had been folded neatly and left on the floor outside her door. And the corridor was empty, and when she came up to the upper deck an hour later he was already there, standing at the rail with a cup of coffee, looking at the horizon with the focused attention of a man who has had an entirely normal night. She walked past him without speaking. "The worst is through," he said, to the horizon. "We should have clear weather by mid-morning." She stopped walking. She did not turn around. "How do you know?" she asked. "The pressure is changing. The birds are coming back." A pause. "And I asked the captain." She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and did not. "Thank you," she said instead. "For the cabin. And for," she stopped. "For sitting outside my door all night in a corridor. For folding the blanket. For being, in some way I cannot yet name, something other than what I've spent 6 years deciding you are. For the information about the weather." She finished. "Of course," he said. She walked on. Behind her, she heard nothing. No movement, no words. Just the sound of the sea, which was already quieter than it had been, and the distant cry of a gull returning to a sky that was beginning, reluctantly, to clear. Vincenzo Carvalho introduced himself at dinner. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of easy confidence that came from having been charming for long enough that it had become effortless, and he was Portuguese. And he was sitting 2 seats down from Eleanor in the ship's small dining saloon when he looked at her half-empty plate and said, in excellent English, "You're not eating that I am aware," Eleanor said. "The sea air takes the appetite for the first few days. After that, it gives it back. Usually all at once and at an inconvenient hour." He smiled. It was a good smile, warm, self-deprecating, genuinely amused. Vincenzo Carvalho. In returning to Lisbon after a year in London, Eleanor Wentworth. She picked up her fork. "Are you from Lisbon originally?" "My family has been in Lisbon for 4 generations. I know the city very well." He tilted his head, the gesture of a man offering something. "If this is your first time, I would be happy to be of assistance. It can be complicated for visitors. Particularly with legal matters." She glanced up at him. "What makes you think I have legal matters? Everyone who comes to Lisbon from England in October has legal matters. The weather is too uncertain for tourism." He said it lightly, as though it were an observation about geography rather than an inference about her circumstances. "The inheritance courts open their new session in November. That is the usual reason." She considered him. He was well dressed without being ostentatious. And his manner was pleasant without being obsequious, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who was genuinely interested in being helpful. She had learned, in 3 years of managing her family's reduced circumstances, to be careful about people who were genuinely interested in being helpful. "That's very kind," she said. "I'll keep it in mind." She was aware, from the corner of her eye, that Alexander was seated at the far end of the same table. He was speaking with the ship's first officer about something nautical. He did not look in her direction. He did not appear to notice that she was speaking with Carvalho. He cut his meat with the precise, economical movements of a man who had other things to think about and was thinking about them. She turned her attention back to her own plate. Carvalho, to his credit, did not press. He told her about Lisbon, the October light, the particular quality of the city's hills. A restaurant near the Alfama district that made a salt cod dish that was, he claimed, the finest argument for the existence of Portugal as a sovereign nation. He was funny, and knowledgeable, and at no point did he say anything that she could identify as a reason not to speak with him, which was, Eleanor thought, exactly the sort of thing that made her want to speak with him less. Later, on deck, when the stars had come out over a sea that was finally, genuinely calm. She was leaning on the rail and thinking about nothing in particular when footsteps stopped beside her. She did not look up. "Carvalho has outstanding debt proceedings in Lisbon," Alexander said. 3 separate creditors. One of them is a legal trustee." She turned to look at him. "He was facing the water." "How do you know that?" She said that he didn't answer. "Why are you telling me?" She said that he was quiet for a moment. The stars reflected in the water below them, broken and reassembled with every small wave. "Consider it information," he said. "Do with it what you like." That he walked away. She stared at the place where had been standing, and then at the water, and then at the stars, and she thought, why does he know Carvalho's debt record? Why did he look it up? Why did he tell me? She did not arrive at answers, but the questions, once started, did not stop. Carvalho found her the next morning on the upper deck with a document that it was a single page, neatly drafted, with her name already filled in at the top in careful English lettering. He presented it with the manner of a man doing a favor, apologetic about the formality of it, reassuring about the simplicity of what it asked. A letter of authorization. He said, "Standard practice for inheritance proceedings in Portugal. It simply allows me to speak to the relevant parties on your behalf before you arrive, so that the paperwork is already in motion when you reach Lisbon. It saves weeks." Eleanor took the document. She read it once, quickly. And then she read it again, slowly. It was very well written. That was the first thing she noticed. It was the kind of document that had been written to be read quickly, with the important clauses tucked into the middle where the eye tends to skim. Surrounded by language that sounded like reassurance, the second thing she noticed was the scope of the authorization. "This allows you to act on my behalf in all matters relating to the estate." She said, only for the preliminary discussions. No. She looked up at him. The language here doesn't say preliminary. It says all matters. That's a different thing, Carvalho smiled. It was still a good smile. You're very careful. My father, she said. Was not careful. I've been learning from his example in the reverse direction. Something shifted in his expression, not much, just a fractional recalibration, the face of a man reassessing the difficulty of a task he had assumed would be simple. He took the document back smoothly. Without making it into a moment. Of course, he said. I can have the language amended. It was drafted for the general case. I should have reviewed it more carefully for your specific situation. My apologies. That's quite all right. She said that it was not quite all right. But she had learned. Also from her father's example, that telling people exactly what you thought of them before you had finished gathering information was strategically inadvisable. She watched him walk away along the deck, and she thought about 3 creditors and a legal trustee. And she thought about a man who had told her that information and then walked away without explanation, and she thought about the word all in the middle of a document that had been designed to look like it didn't contain the word all, that evening. Alexander passed her in the narrow corridor outside the dining saloon. There was barely room for 2 people to walk abreast. He stepped to one side, she stepped to the same side, they performed the brief, absurd dance of 2 people in a passageway, and then they were still, 6 inches apart. With nowhere useful to look, the document. She said. He wants authorization over the full estate. Alexander's expression did not change. Yes, you knew he'd approach me with something like this that I suspected, and you told me about the debt proceedings, so I'd be prepared. That he said nothing. Which was, she had now thoroughly established. His version of yes. She looked at him for a moment. He was close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes, which she had not previously had occasion to notice, and the faint lines at the corners of them that had not been there 6 years ago. And the way he was looking at her, not through her, not past her, not at some middle distance where he usually seemed to prefer to focus his attention, but at her, directly, as though she were something that required his full concentration. Thank you. She said. Again, you don't need to keep thanking me, then stop doing things that require it. Something moved in his face. There and gone, like the alteration she had almost seen the first day on deck. That he stepped back. The corridor widened again into its ordinary dimensions. Good night. Miss Wentworth, he said. Good night, Your Grace, she said. She went into the dining saloon and sat down and stared at the menu and did not read a single word of it. She requested a meeting with Carvalho the following afternoon. She chose the upper deck, in full view of the other passengers. Which was a deliberate choice. She had found, in her years of navigating reduced circumstances, that conversations of a certain type went better in public. It limited the range of responses available to the other party. And it meant there was no question afterward about what had been said or by whom. Carvalho arrived punctually. He had brought a revised document. I've had the language narrowed, he said, with the ease of a man who had spent the morning preparing for exactly this. Preliminary discussions only. No binding authority. I think you'll find it addresses your concerns. She took it. She read that it was better. It was considerably better. He had, in fact, done what he said he had done. The scope was limited, the language was clearer. And a person reading it without prior suspicion would have found it entirely reasonable. She set it on the small deck table between them. Demar. Carvalho, she said. Who holds the legal trusteeship on my father's cousin's estate? A pause. Brief. But there. Am not certain of the current. I am. She folded her hands on the table. His name is Enrique Saraiva. He was appointed 18 months ago. When my father's cousin became too ill to manage his own affairs. I have his name from my family's solicitor in London. She paused. Is he one of your 3 creditors? The smile stayed on Carvalho's face. But it stopped reaching his eyes. I don't know where you heard. Is he one of your 3 creditors? Silenced at I see, she said. She stood up. She took the document and folded it once, neatly, and held it out to him. He took it. Because there was nothing else to do, you're a very good conversationalist, she said. And Lisbon in October genuinely does sound beautiful. I hope you have a pleasant arrival. She walked back toward the hatch that led below decks. She was 3 steps away when she heard him say, behind her. Your family's situation is known in certain circles, Miss Wentworth. You'll find Lisbon is not as welcoming as you hope. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She let the words settle not into her, but around her, the way you let cold water settle before you step into it. So that you understand its temperature. Then she turned down. Why family's situation, she said, is none of your concern. Nor is my welcome in Lisbon. Nor, I think, is anything about my circumstances your business any longer. She kept her voice even, the way she had learned to keep it even. Because the alternative was letting people see what they'd aimed at. I would suggest you focus your energy on your creditors. Mr. Carvalho. I imagine they require rather more of your attention than I do. She went below. She did not go to the dining saloon. She went to the cabin and sat on the edge of the berth and breathed. Your family's situation is known in certain circles. As though that were a weapon. As though she hadn't spent 3 years learning to carry it like luggage, heavy, inconvenient, occasionally mortifying, but ultimately just a thing she had to manage. She was not going to let Vincenzo Carvalho, with his good smile and his fraudulent documents, make her feel like it was something worse than that. She was not. She was sitting very still and practicing not feeling it when someone knocked on the cabin door. She knew the knock. She had, apparently, learned it. Come in, she said. Alexander opened the door and stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, one of those direct, full attention looks that she had recently discovered he was capable of, and said, nothing that I dealt with it. She said, that I know. I saw that. Of course he had seen. He had probably been watching the entire conversation from somewhere on the upper deck, because he was apparently a man who watched things and said nothing and stored the information away for later use. That he said, my family's situation is known. She said. She was not sure why she said it. She did not generally say things like that. She had a policy against saying things like that. That it is known, Alexander said. She looked up at him. That isn't the same as it defining what you're worth. He said. Though I understand that the distinction is easier to maintain in theory than in practice. She stared at him. In 6 years, in every brief, uncomfortable, formally polite encounter they had ever had, he had never said anything that was not either logistical or indifferent. He had never said anything that acknowledged her as a person who had an interior life that might be affected by things. You told me about the debt proceedings before ID asked. She said. Her voice was careful. Before ID given any indication that I was going to speak with him at all. You told me the first evening that he was quiet. You were watching him, she said. From the beginning. You already knew who he was. Still nothing, Alexander. She used his name without thinking. Without the title, the way she had not used it in 6 years, and she watched something happen in his face that she could not name, only register. Why? He looked at her for a long time. Because you were traveling alone, he said, and I was not. That it was not, she thought. The full answer. It was the answer he had decided was the permissible portion of the full answer, the part that could be said without saying the rest. She could see the rest of it behind his eyes, whatever it was, closed off and unavailable. Like a room with the door shut, but it was more than he had said in 6 years, and she felt it land somewhere she wasn't prepared for, and she did not know what to do with that. So she did the thing she had always done, which was to put it somewhere safe and deal with it later. Sit down, she said. If you're going to stand in doorways looking significant, you might as well be useful. Tell me what else you know about Saraiva. That he sat. He told her. Outside the porthole, the Atlantic moved past them, grey and enormous and entirely indifferent, and the distance between them, which had been a very precisely maintained 6 years of careful nothing, shifted by some increment that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt. The second storm came without warning. That was not entirely true. The captain had warned them, and the first officer had warned them. And the barometric pressure had been warning anyone who knew how to read it for the better part of 6 hours. But it came without the psychological preparation that the first storm had allowed, and it came harder. And it came at 3 in the morning when the boat's defenses are at their lowest and the mind has temporarily suspended its policy of rational interpretation. Eleanor was awake when it hit. She had been awake for an hour. Lying in the dark thinking about Sareva and the legal trusteeship and the amended document and the way Alexander had said because you were traveling alone and I was not, turning the sentence over like a stone to look at what lived underneath it, when the ship lurched. She was already sitting up, the sound was different from the first storm. Lower. More serious. The kind of sound that a structure makes when it is being asked to do something at the outer limit of its design tolerance. She heard running feet on the deck above her, and shouting. And the particular organized urgency of a crew that had trained for this and was now performing it for real. She dressed in the dark. She found her traveling case and moved it to the highest point in the cabin. Which was a gesture of optimism more than strategy. She braced herself against the writing table and waited. The ship dropped, not rolled, dropped. The bottom falling away as a wave the size of something that didn't have a good human scale comparison passed underneath them, and the Esperanza came down the other side of it with a sound like a building settling after an earthquake. The porthole on the port side of the cabin, her porthole. The captain's cabin porthole, the structurally sound porthole, showed her a wall of water, then it showed her the sky, then the door opened. Alexander had to use his shoulder to get it open against the angle of the ship. He came in without knocking, which was the first time he had done that. And he was dressed and his hair was wet and he was holding the doorframe with one hand in a way that suggested the corridor was not behaving reliably. He looked at her. She was standing braced against the table with both hands, fully dressed, and she looked back at him. "You're all right," he said. It was not quite a question. Yes. The porthole. I know. This side of the ship is taking the full roll. I need to. He stopped. He looked at her again, a quick, assessing look that started at her face and went nowhere else. I need you to move to the interior wall. Away from the porthole. She moved. He crossed the cabin in 2 steps and checked the porthole latch, tightening it with a turn that suggested it had not been as secure as advertised. And then he checked the second latch at the top and the seal at the base, and she watched him do it with the focused efficiency of a man who knew what he was looking for. "You've been in bad weather at sea before," she said. "Yes, often." "Often enough." He stepped back from the porthole. The ship lurched again and he adjusted his balance without looking at his feet. The automatic correction of a body that had learned to do it. "There's a passage on the interior side of the deck below that will be more stable. I'd like you to." "I'm not moving to the deck below," she said. "I'm perfectly capable of." "I know you're capable." His voice was even. Not sharp. Not patronizing. Even. "I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting that I would prefer." He stopped again. She waited. The ship groaned, a long resonant complaint from somewhere in its hull, and the lantern swung between them on its hook. And the light moved across his face in slow arcs. "That I would prefer," he said, more quietly, "to know where you are." She looked at him. That he was looking back at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of which she could fully identify, and the lantern swung. And the storm pressed against the hull, and she thought, he came here first. Before he went anywhere else, or checked anything else, or spoke to anyone else, he came here. "You checked the porthole latch?" She said, "Yes, before you came in." "That's why the door. You weren't just checking on me. You came specifically because you knew this porthole was on the wrong side." That he said nothing. "How did you know which porthole was mine?" "It's my cabin," he said. "I know which porthole it is." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." A pause. Outside, something on the upper deck broke loose and skidded the length of the ship with a sound like an argument. "I've been watching the weather," he said. "I've been watching which side of the ship it was coming from." "For how long?" He looked at her for a moment that stretched past its natural length. "Since the first storm," he said. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood with her back against the interior wall, as had asked. And he stood in the middle of the cabin with one hand still on the porthole frame, and the storm worked at the ship from outside with patient, impersonal force. And she thought about 6 hours of weather monitoring and which side the wind was coming from and a porthole latch that had not been fully secured. "You should go," she said. There are other passengers, the other passengers are being seen to, then you should. Eleanor. Just her name. No title. The same word head said on the deck the first day, but different now, not clipped, not minimal. But carrying something she couldn't identify the weight of. "I'm not leaving," she breathed. "All right," she said. That he stayed, that he didn't sit. He stood near the porthole with his hand loosely on the frame, not because he needed the support but because it gave him something to do with that hand. And she sat on the edge of the berth with her hands in her lap, and the storm raged, and neither of them said anything for a long time. At some point she said, "Why did you give me the cabin that I told you?" "Structural." "That's not why." The lantern swung. No, he said. "It's not." "Then why?" He turned to look at her. Directly, fully, the way he had looked at her in the corridor and in the dining saloon and in every moment when he forgot to look away, and she thought, he's been doing this the whole time. "I've been misreading every single instance of it, because you were alone," he said. "And the storm was getting worse, and he stopped." He turned back to the porthole. "I'm not any gentleman, Eleanor. I mean that I am not doing this because it is what any gentleman would do." The ship tilted. She gripped the edge of the berth. "Then what are you doing it for?" she said. Very quietly. He didn't answer. He stood at the porthole with his back half turned to her, and outside the storm did what storms do, and inside the cabin the silence between his last word and his next one stretched out into something that had its own weight and texture, and she sat with it. And she didn't push. He stayed until the worst had passed, when the motion of the ship had settled back into something the body could negotiate. He crossed to the door and opened it, and paused with his hand on the frame. "Try to sleep." He said. "Alexander." He stopped. "I am not any gentleman either," she said. "I mean that I haven't been treating this as I haven't been treating you." As she stopped. She didn't know how to finish it. She had a great many words and none of them were the right ones. "Good night," she said. "Good night." He said. That he closed the door. She sat on the edge of the berth in the dark and listened to the storm diminishing, and she thought. "I'm not any gentleman. Not I have a duty. Not any reasonable person would. Not structural engineering. That I am not any gentleman." She thought about that for a very long time. The sea was flat the next morning, unreasonably. Offensively flat, the kind of calm that follows a bad storm, as though the ocean is embarrassed about the previous evening and attempting to compensate. The sky was the particular washed blue of a surface that has recently been cleaned by force. And the Esperanza moved through it with the slightly dazed quality of a ship that has survived something and not yet decided how to feel about it. Eleanor came up to the deck at 7 and found it mostly empty. The crew were conducting repairs with the subdued efficiency of people who had done this before. A loose section of railing had been roped off. The hatch cover on the port side had been replaced. Alexander was at the stern, speaking with the first officer. She watched him from across the deck. He was pointing at something on a chart the officer was holding. And the officer was nodding, and he was explaining something with the focused brevity of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to communicate and how many words it required. He did not look like a man who had spent a night standing in someone's cabin with his hand on a porthole frame. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who was managing the situation. She went to the rail and looked at the water. He found her there an hour later. "The first officer estimates 2 days to Lisbon," he said. "The storm pushed us slightly off course, but the wind is favorable." "Good." She said. That he stood beside her. Not close, not at the careful social distance he usually maintained, but a middle distance, as though the previous night had renegotiated the geography between them without anyone explicitly agreeing to new terms. "You should eat," he said. "You didn't come to dinner last night." "That I was occupied with the ship trying to sink us, before the storm." She glanced at him. He was looking at the water. "I wasn't hungry," she said. "You haven't been eating properly since Portsmouth." She turned to look at him fully. He continued to look at the water. "You've been watching what I eat?" she said. "I've been watching whether you eat," he said. As though the distinction were important. "There's a difference," that is, she searched for the right word. Extraordinary was too much. Unusual was insufficient. "That is a great deal of attention to pay to another passenger." "Yes," he said, "just that." "Yes. No qualification." No retreat into the language of duty or propriety or structural engineering. Just a simple, undefended acknowledgement that it was a great deal of attention. And that he had paid it. She turned back to the water. She could feel her heart doing something unreliable. The storm did something to your hair, she said. It was possibly the most inconsequential thing she had ever said. And she said it because she needed to say something that was not the thing she was actually thinking. That he reached up and touched his hair, and she watched his hand, a quick, self-conscious movement, entirely unlike him. The gesture of a man who had briefly forgotten to be composed, and something turned over in her chest. The officer asked, she said, whether we were acquainted. When he came to tell me about the cabin, what did you say? I said we had mutual connections. That he was quiet. That we do have mutual connections, she said. My brother was at school with your cousin. Your father knew my father. We have attended between the ages of 17 and 23. I have attended 41 social events at which you were also present. She stopped. I counted once. During a particularly tedious house party in which there was nothing else to do. He turned to look at her. Then, 41. He said, 41, you counted that I had time. She looked back at the water. My point is that we are not strangers. We have been very precisely not strangers for 6 years. Which is a different thing, and perhaps a more complicated one. A pause. The water moved beneath them, slow and glassy. Yes. He said. It is. That night he did not sleep in the corridor. She knew this because she opened the door at midnight, not for any particular reason, she told herself, simply to see if the air in the passageway was any cooler, and the corridor was empty. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the empty floor where, 2 nights ago, he had been sitting with her blanket. Then she went back inside and left the door open. 20 minutes later she heard footsteps pause outside. The air is cooler in the corridor, she said, to the open doorway. A pause. So I've been informed. He said that he leaned against the doorframe, not coming in, not going away, occupying the threshold in the particular manner of a man who has made a decision and is not entirely sure it was the right one. She was sitting on the berth with a book she had not been reading, and he was in the doorway. And the ship moved gently beneath them with nothing urgent left to say. Tell me about Lisbon, she said. You've been there before, twice. Once for diplomatic purposes, once because my ship was rerouted in bad weather. What's it like? He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it, genuinely thinking. Not calculating, not deciding how much to give away, just remembering. Yellow, he said. The buildings are yellow. In a particular way. And the light comes off the river in the evening and hits everything at an angle that makes the whole city look like it's been painted rather than built. A pause. The food is better than anything you'll find in London. The coffee is better. The people are direct. In a way that the English find unsettling, but that I've always found restful. She smiled. She was facing away from him, toward the porthole, and the smile was her own private thing. You find directness restful, she said. That I find the absence of implication restful. He said. London is a city of implication. Everything means something other than what it is. It's exhausting. She thought about that. That why you're so. She paused. You say the minimum. Always. Everything precisely calculated to the amount required and no more. A silence that was not an absence of response but a consideration of one. Yes, he said. Partly, and the other part. He didn't answer that, but he stayed in the doorway, and she didn't turn around, and they talked about Lisbon until the ship's bell struck 2. And somewhere in the middle of it she fell asleep, sitting up with the unread book in her lap, and she didn't hear him leave. And in the morning there was a blanket over her shoulders that she had not put there herself. She sat with that for a long time before she got up. The last night before Lisbon was clear, the kind of clear that only exists at sea. Far enough from land that there is no ambient light to compete with the sky, a darkness so complete that the stars had depth to them, layers, some close and some impossibly distant. The whole thing arranged with the careless extravagance of something that had not been designed for human appreciation but achieved it anyway. Eleanor had not intended to go up to the deck. She had been sitting in the cabin with her traveling case open, making a precise inventory of what she would need for the first meeting with Sareva's office. organizing her father's letters and her solicitor's documentation into an order that would be legible to a Portuguese legal clerk who had never met her and had no particular reason to take her seriously. She was good at this, at making a case from available materials, at presenting the most defensible version of a complicated situation. She had been practicing it for 3 years. She had been doing it for 40 minutes when she closed the case and went up to the deck. She told herself it was the air. The cabin had been close all evening. The porthole not quite adequate. This was a reasonable explanation, and she was going to use it. That he was already there. Of course he was. He was standing at the stern rail looking at the wake of the ship, which spread out behind them in the dark water like a road being unmade. And he had his hands loosely on the rail and his coat was open at the collar, and he looked for the first time in the week she had been watching him like a man who had briefly stopped performing composure and was simply standing in it. She walked to the rail and stood beside him, not close, and looked at the same water. For a while neither of them said anything. This was, she had discovered, something they were capable of: shared silence without the obligation to fill it. The kind of quiet that was not the absence of communication but a form of it. She had not known this about him. She had not known this about herself either. In relation to him. We arrive tomorrow, she said. Yes. Early afternoon. If the wind holds, and you have business in Lisbon, diplomatic correspondence to deliver. A meeting with the British consul. Nothing that requires more than 2 days, and then you return. Yes. She looked at the stars reflected in the water. They moved with the ship's motion. The whole reflected sky shifting and reforming with each gentle roll. I may be in Lisbon for 3 weeks, she said. Possibly 4, depending on the legal proceedings. I know. She glanced at him. He was still looking at the wake. You know. She said that I asked your timeline when we discussed Saraiva. She thought back. He had asked about the timing of her inheritance proceedings. She had answered, they had moved on. She had not registered it as the kind of question that was asked for a particular reason. She was, she thought, going to have to revise a great many of her notations. The painting, she said. She had not planned to say it. It arrived in her mouth fully formed, without consultation. As though some part of her that was tired of waiting had decided to stop waiting. That he turned to look at her. I in my father's library, she said. The one I said had no soul. What happened to it? A pause. Not a hesitation, a consideration. There was a difference, she had learned. Why do you ask? He said that I don't know, she said, which was true. I've been thinking about it. I thought about it on the ship. I think I've been thinking about it for longer than I've been on the ship, actually, without realizing that's what I was doing. She stopped. That's a strange thing to say. Yes. He said. But he didn't say it dismissively. He said it the way he said things that were true, and that he wasn't going to dispute that. Why father sold most of the collection. She said. When it became necessary. I don't know what happened to that one specifically. I always assumed it went with the others. That he was quiet. The ship moved beneath them. The stars moved in the water, did it? She said that he looked at her for a moment that was long enough to have a shape, a beginning and a duration, and something at the end of it that she could not yet name. Then he took one hand off the rail and turned toward her slightly. And she thought he was going to answer. She could see him deciding to answer, could see the decision happening in his face, and instead he kissed her. It was not tentative. It was not the careful, socially negotiated approach of a man performing a romantic gesture. It was the kiss of a person who had been not doing something for a long time and had arrived at the end of their capacity to continue not doing it, purposeful and a little desperate, and entirely without the protective layer of irony that he wore over everything else. She kissed him back. She did this, she would think afterward. Before she had finished deciding to. Her hands found the lapels of his coat and she kissed him back, and the reflected stars moved in the water below them, and the wake of the ship continued to unmake itself behind them, and for a period of time that she did not measure. The case she had been building in her cabin, and the legal documents in precise order, and Saraiva and the inheritance and the 3 weeks in Lisbon were all somewhere else entirely. When they stopped, they were still close. His forehead was almost against hers. She could feel him breathing. The painting, she said, very quietly. Eleanor. You didn't answer the question. A breath. She felt it against her cheek. No, he said. I didn't. She waited. This changes nothing, he said. His voice was low and careful, and carrying something underneath the carefulness that she could hear but not yet reach. Tomorrow we arrive in Lisbon. You have legal proceedings and I have diplomatic obligations, and the circumstances of the crossing do not. I know. She said that. He pulled back slightly. He looked at her. You know. He said that. I know that you believe that. I know that tomorrow you will be the Duke of Ascot with diplomatic correspondence to deliver, and I will be Eleanor Wentworth with an inheritance to salvage, and the space between those two things will feel very large and very real. She kept her voice steady. She was extremely good at steady. I know all of that. I'm choosing to be here anyway. That he looked at her for a long time. That isn't. He stopped. Started again. You understand what You're telling me this doesn't change anything, she said. I heard you, and I think, she said carefully, that you are a man who is very practiced at deciding what things mean. What things are allowed to mean. She held his gaze. I think you have decided what this means before it has finished meaning it. Silence. The ship moved. The stars above them were indifferent and enormous. Good night. Alexander, she said. She went below. She lay in the berth in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought. He did not answer the question about the painting. He had had the opportunity. He had made the decision to answer. And then he had kissed her instead, which was. She was beginning to understand. The Alexander Hartley version of answering, which meant the answer was something that could not be said, which meant the answer was something that he had been carrying for long enough that saying it was not a simple act. She thought about that until the sky outside the porthole began to lighten. And she did not sleep, and she did not mind. Lisbon was yellow, as he had said. She stood on the deck as the ship came into the Tagus and watched the city reveal itself in the morning light, the hills, the white and yellow buildings. The particular angle of the October sun off the river that turned everything gold, and she thought, he said it looks like it was painted rather than built. He had been right. It looked exactly like that. He was on the deck. He was standing at the opposite rail, speaking with the first officer about the docking procedure, and he did not look at her, and she did not look at him. And the city came toward them on both sides, and the river was wide and full of light. The reception was held that evening at the British consulate. It was an unavoidable event. The consul had written to her months ago, a formal welcome for any British nationals arriving for extended stays. The kind of gathering that existed primarily to allow the local English community to assess the new arrivals and file them appropriately. Eleanor had packed one good dress for exactly this occasion, and she wore it. And she went. Alexander was already there when she arrived. He was standing with the consul and two other men she didn't know, and he was performing the public version of himself, the version she had seen at 100 similar gatherings over 6 years. That she had always read as simple indifference. The composed face, the measured attention, the precise and minimal social presentation of a man who was present because his position required it and would leave when duty permitted. She knew, now. What lived behind that. She was not sure that knowledge made it easier. He saw her come in. She knew he saw her because she was watching from the doorway, and she saw his eyes move to her face and then, with the controlled deliberateness of a man making a decision, move away. She went to speak with the consul's wife. Later, over supper, she was seated 4 places down from him on the same side of the table, which meant she could not see his face without turning, which was probably fortunate. She spoke with the woman on her left, who knew Lisbon's inheritance courts well and offered 3 practical suggestions about Saraiva's office that were worth more than anything Carvalho had proposed. She made a note of a solicitor's name. She ate. Because she was in a city with good food and she had not eaten properly in a week, she was doing very well, she thought. Then someone asked how she had come to Lisbon, and she said on the Esperança, and the man across the table an attaché of some kind, with the look of a man who catalogued information professionally, said, "Ah, Ascot came on the Esperança as well. Did you travel together?" "We were on the same ship," she said. "We have mutual acquaintances." A terrible crossing. By all accounts. The second storm particularly. He glanced down the table toward Alexander. Though I imagine the Duke is not easily rattled. He has a reputation for what is it they say not requiring much in the way of comfort. Entirely self-contained, yes, Eleanor said, cold fish. Some say. The attaché smiled, meant to be confidential and collegial. Though I've always found him perfectly civil. Just not given to warmth. You know the type, yes. She said. I know the type. She cut a piece of fish and ate it and did not look down the table. She heard Alexander's voice, some response to a question the consul had asked, something about the trade corridor discussions. 3 sentences in that precise and measured delivery, and she sat with the attache's words, not given to warmth, entirely self-contained. Cold fish, and she thought about a blanket folded outside a cabin door. About a porthole latch checked from the outside. About I've been watching which side the storm was coming from. About I'm not any gentleman, cold fish. She thought. Is that what it looks like from the outside? That I asked that what it looked like to me, 6 years ago, after supper, in the moment before the room reorganized itself for the next phase of the evening. She found herself briefly near him. Not by design or not entirely. He had moved toward the window, she had been walking toward the door, they were close enough to speak quietly. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said. Miss Wentworth. Polite. Formal. The voice of a man at a diplomatic function managing his social obligations. Your Grace, she said, in the same register. He held her gaze for 1 second longer than the situation required, then someone spoke to him, and he turned. And she walked out into the Lisbon night, and she stood outside on the steps of the consulate under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, and she told herself, very firmly, that she had always known this was what it would look like in the daylight. She had known it on the ship, she had said I know, she had meant it. She pressed her hands together and breathed the night air, which smelled like the river and something flowering that she didn't have a name for. And she thought, Miss Wentworth. After everything. After the porthole latch and the corridor and the blanket and the wake of the ship and his forehead almost against hers. And what she had asked about the painting and what he had not said, Miss Wentworth, she went back to her lodgings. She did not look back. Carvalho found her on the 3rd day, she had known he would. Lisbon was not London, it was a city of particular neighborhoods and particular routes. And the English community occupied a narrow slice of it. And she had known from the moment she saw him on the ship that the Esperança was not the last place their paths would cross. She was outside Saraiva's office building when he appeared. The meeting had not gone well. Saraiva's clerk had been polite in the way that Portuguese legal clerks were polite to English women traveling without male accompaniment, which was to say, thoroughly, and at considerable length. And without providing any of the information she had requested. She had spent an hour being managed and had emerged onto the street with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been treated with great courtesy and no respect. Carvalho was leaning against the wall opposite, Miss Wentworth. He said. What a coincidence that I said, she said. That he fell into step beside her. She did not slow down. That I heard your meeting with Saraiva's office was unproductive, he said. These things often are. Initially. The clerks are cautious with new parties. It takes time to establish. Mr. Carvalho. She stopped walking. She turned to face him. What do you want? He smiled. It was a different smile from the one on the ship, less warm, more precise. The expression of a man who had decided that a particular approach had failed and was moving to another. I want to help you. I've said that from the beginning. You want access to the estate, she said. Through me, because I'm the most recent claimant with legal standing. And if I authorize your involvement, you can use my standing to negotiate with Saraiva directly, and whatever you negotiate will include provisions for your own debt to be cleared from the estate's assets before any inheritance is dispersed. She watched his face. Incorrect. Aren't I? A pause. The street moved around them, a cart, 2 women with baskets, a dog investigating the base of a fountain. You're very clever. He said. The warmth was entirely gone now. But cleverness without resources is limited in its utility. You need someone who knows how things work here. Without assistance, those proceedings could take years. Your family's situation. My family's situation, she said, is not a lever you get to use, Miss Wentworth. I would like you to leave me alone now that I don't think, he said, and his voice had changed, dropped into something quieter and less pleasant, that you fully understand your position here. You are a young woman, alone, in a city you don't know. With a legal claim that will be disputed by parties who have had 18 months to arrange their affairs. The clerk you spoke to this morning reports to Sareva. Sareva knows you're here. And without someone to navigate that for you. She has someone, the voice came from behind her, she turned. Alexander was standing 10 feet away on the pavement, and he had clearly been there for some portion of the conversation, and he was looking at Carvalho with the expression she had seen him use on the ship with the first officer, not cold, precisely, but entirely without temperature. The face of a man who has assessed a situation and found it uncomplicated. Carvalho looked at him. Something shifted in his posture. Your Grace, he said. The easy manner was still there, but it was working harder now. Carvalho. Alexander walked forward until he was standing beside Eleanor. Not in front of her, beside her. Which she noted. I've been in correspondence with the British consul's office since we arrived. They have an interest in protecting British nationals from fraudulent claims against inherited assets. Particularly when the fraud involves a legal trustee. He paused. Particularly when the correspondence between that trustee and his creditors has been documented. Carvalho was very still. That I don't know what you think you. I think, Alexander said. That you wrote to Sareva from London 6 weeks before the Esperança sailed. I think the letter outlined a proposal for the use of Miss Wentworth's legal standing to consolidate your debt. I think you arranged to be on that ship because you knew she would be on it. A pause. Not for effect. He was not a man who paused for effect. He paused because he had finished one sentence and was beginning the next, and the wait between them was simply what the content required. The consul's office has a copy of that letter. The street continued around them. Indifferent. Carvalho looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing she needed to say. Alexander had said it, with the precision of a man who had spent 3 days in Lisbon doing something other than diplomatic correspondence. And Carvalho's face was doing the arithmetic. This is Carvalho started. You should attend to your creditors, Alexander said. They've been patient. I wouldn't rely on that continuing. Carvalho left that he did not say anything further. He simply turned and walked away down the street. And the city absorbed him, and the cart came back the other way, and the dog was still at the fountain. Eleanor stood on the pavement and breathed. You wrote to the consul's office. She said, yes, before the reception, yes, before she stopped. That letter from London. The one Carvalho wrote to Sareva. How did you get a copy of that? He was quiet for a moment. I have a contact in the postal service. He monitors correspondence of interest to the Foreign Office, and Carvalho's correspondence was of interest to the Foreign Office. It became of interest, Alexander said. When I asked someone to make it so, she turned to look at him. He was watching the street where Carvalho had gone, his hands behind his back. His expression settled into that composed attentiveness he wore when he was thinking about something he was not going to say directly. When did you start looking into him? She said. On the ship. The evening he approached you. That was the first day. Yes, she stared at him. The first day. Before had done anything before there was any. You looked into a man you'd never met because he spoke to me at dinner. He said nothing, Alexander. He looked at her. Why? She said. Not the answer you gave me on the ship. Not because you were traveling alone. The real answer. The street was quiet around them. The afternoon light hit the yellow buildings at the angle he had described, the painted Ratherthanbolt angle. And his face was in the light and she could see all of it, all the places where the composed surface was doing what composed surfaces do, which was to contain something that had been contained for a very long time, because, he said. I was not willing to watch someone take advantage of you while I was standing close enough to prevent it. You've been standing close enough to prevent things for some time, she said. By your own account, yes. 6 years is a long time to stand close enough. The light moved. A cloud. Somewhere above them, adjusting its position. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come with me. I want to show you something." "What?" "I found a restaurant," she said. "Near the Alfama. The salt cod is, apparently, the finest argument for the existence of Portugal as a sovereign nation." She paused. "Someone told me about it on a ship." Something happened in his face. The thing that was almost a smile, that she had now seen enough times to recognize. That was his face briefly forgetting what it was supposed to be doing. "That I recall," he said. "Good," she said. "Then you know the way." They walked. She found the painting on the 5th day. She had gone to his residence, the house the Foreign Office kept for visiting officials. A narrow building on a hill above the river with yellow walls and a blue door, because she had a question about Saravas' revised terms that required a legal opinion she trusted, and because she had a letter from his consul contact that needed to be forwarded. And because these were both entirely legitimate reasons to go and she was using them, the housekeeper showed her into the study to wait. That it was a small room. Books, a writing table. A window that looked out over the river with the afternoon light coming through it in the particular way she was beginning to understand was specific to this city, sideways, golden, insisting on being noticed. A chair. A lamp, and on the wall, opposite the window, a painting. She saw it and stopped. That it was not large. It was perhaps 2 feet across. A landscape, Italian. A countryside scene with a farmhouse in the middle distance and hills beyond, and a sky that took up more than half the canvas. The brushwork was technically proficient. The composition was balanced. It was, by any objective measure, a competent and pleasantly decorative piece. She knew it. She had stood in front of it in her father's library when she was 17 years old and said, to no one in particular, that it was merely expensive and had no soul. She was still standing in front of it when he came in. She heard the door and did not turn. She heard him come into the room, and she heard him stop. And she heard the particular quality of silence that falls when a person understands what another person is looking at. Neither of them spoke. She looked at the painting. She looked at the farmhouse in the middle distance, which was, she now thought, more interesting than she had given it credit for at 17. There was something in the light around it, the way the painter had handled the late afternoon shadows, that suggested a particular time of day and a particular quality of quiet. It was not a painting about the farmhouse. It was a painting about the moment before something happens, when the light is that specific color and the world is briefly, completely still. She had missed that. At 17. She had missed that entirely. "Why father sold it," she said. Her voice was steady. She had a policy about her voice. "When it became necessary. I didn't know which pieces went where. I thought they all went to the same buyer. They went to auction," he said. "I attended the auction." She turned around. He was standing near the door, which he had closed behind him. And he was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued, the one that did several things at once, and he made no move to come further into the room or to retreat from it. "You went to my father's auction," she said. "Yes." "You bought this?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" He was quiet, and she watched him doing the thing she now recognized, weighing, calculating what portion of the answer was permissible. Dividing the truth into the part that could be said and the part that could not. She had watched him do this for a week on a ship. She had watched him do it in corridors and on decks and over salt cod in the Alfama while the light came off the river. "Alexander," she said, "I'm not on a ship anymore. There's no storm to manage. There's no consul's reception where the right answer is Miss Wentworth and nothing further. There is no—" She stopped. She started again. More quietly. "I've been in this city for 5 days and I have thought about that painting, every single one of them, and I did not know why until 30 seconds ago. Tell me why you bought it." He looked at her, then he crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. Close enough that she had to look up, close enough that she could see the places where the composed surface was simply no longer operating, where the long habit of containment had run out of material to work with. "Because I was there," he said. "When you said it had no soul." She waited. "You were 17. You were standing in front of 3 paintings your father had bought as an investment, and you were talking to them, not to anyone in the room. Because you didn't know I was there. And you said what you actually thought. His voice was low and entirely without its usual careful calibration. Not what was appropriate. Not what was expected. Not what would reflect well or poorly on you in the assessment of anyone present. You said it is merely expensive and it has no soul because that was the truth as you saw it. And you said it to the painting itself because the painting deserved to know that he stopped, that is the most he stopped again. Breathed. I had spent the previous 2 years in rooms full of people saying things they did not mean to other people who did not believe them. Every sentence a negotiation. Every word a position. And I was standing in your father's doorway, and you were 17 years old and talking to a painting. And I thought a pause. Long. The length of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. I thought that I had never in my life wanted to be a painting more than I did at that moment. She stared at him, because then you would have talked to me, he said. Very quietly. Actually talked to me. The way you talked to it, the room was very still, outside the window, the light was doing what the light in Lisbon did in the late afternoon, insisting on itself, golden and sideways, and the river moved in the distance. And she thought about a 17-year-old girl who had not known anyone was listening and a man who had been listening ever since. You should have told me. She said. Her voice was not entirely steady. She had suspended the policy that I know. 6 years ago. Or at any point in 6 you should have. I know. He held her gaze. Your father's situation made it impossible. Not because of the money, because any approach I made after his losses became public would have looked like charity, or calculation. Or I was not willing for you to think that what I felt was contingent on what you had. I was not willing to be another person treating you as a problem to be managed. A pause. So I managed nothing. I managed the distance. I thought I believed it was what I owed you, and the ship. She said, the ship, he said, was the first time in 6 years that I could not manage the distance. She looked at him. She looked at the painting. She looked at him again. The painting is not merely expensive. She said. I was wrong about that. There's something in the light around the farmhouse. The time of day it's capturing. I missed it at 17. Yes, he said. I know. I've been looking at it for 6 years. Something broke open in her chest, quietly. The way things break when they have been held together for a long time, and the reason for holding them finally stops. She reached up and put her hand against his face, just her palm against his jaw, the simplest possible gesture, and she felt him go very still. The stillness of a man who has stopped performing stillness and arrived at the real thing. That I am not going back to England for 4 weeks, she said. That I know. He said, your diplomatic obligations take 2 days. That I am aware. So you have 26 days in which you have no particular reason to be anywhere. He looked at her, and the almost smile was there, the real one, the one his face arrived at when it forgot to be composed, and it was, she discovered, the best thing she had seen in a very long time. That I may, he said, be able to extend my consultations with the consul's office. Good, she said. The consul's wife knows the inheritance courts very well. Shall be useful, extremely practical, he said. That I learned from someone. She said. He has very high standards. That he kissed her, and the light came through the window, and the river moved in the distance, and outside the yellow city went about its business without particular interest in what was happening in a small study on a hill above the Tagus. Where a painting of a farmhouse in the late afternoon light had been waiting 6 years for the person who had once talked to it to come and see what she had missed. She had chosen to stay. She had not been left without a choice.